At my daughter's wedding, I overheard my son-in-law telling his best man that he had cheated on her and was only marrying for our family's money. So I just made one call, and right before he said, "I do," the police walked in. The look on Brad's face when those handcuffs appeared was worth every sleepless night I'd spent investigating this fraud. If you're watching this story unfold, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. I love hearing from people who appreciate good revenge served ice cold. But let me back up 6 months, because this disaster didn't happen overnight. Brad Thompson was playing the long game, and unfortunately for him, I've been playing longer. It started when my daughter Sarah brought home what she called the perfect man. I'm 55 years old, and when something seems too perfect, it usually is. But Sarah was 32, successful in marketing, and I figured she could handle her own love life. Wrong again. Sarah and I have been tight since her father David died 5 years ago. David left us comfortable. His engineering patents and life insurance meant we weren't worried about money. House paid off. Sarah had her college fund turned into savings, and I had enough for comfortable retirement. We weren't flashy, but in Cedar Ridge, word gets around about who has what. Brad appeared like a romance novel character. Tall, dark hair, blue eyes that seemed sincere, and a smile that could sell ice to penguins. He drove a nice BMW, dressed sharp, and claimed to work in investment consulting. Fancy talk for, I help rich people shuffle money around. First Sunday dinner, I watched him work my dining room like a politician at a town hall. Complimented my pot roast, asked intelligent questions about David's engineering work, showed perfect interest in family photos. He brought expensive flowers from downtown, not gas station carnations. "Mrs. Harrison," he said, taking my hand with both of his in that practiced way that immediately triggered my bullshit detector. "Sarah's told me so much about you. I can see where she gets her strength and grace." Grace. If he only knew my idea of grace was not telling him what I really thought of his oversized charm offensive. But Sarah was glowing, absolutely radiant in a way I hadn't seen since before David died. She hung on Brad's every word, laughed at jokes that weren't funny, and kept shooting me hopeful looks that screamed, "Please like him, Mom." So I smiled and played charmed future mother-in-law, because that's what moms do. We bite our tongues and hope our instincts are wrong. After dinner, while Sarah got dessert, Brad settled in David's chair like he owned it and started casual questions about our financial situation. How was I managing as a widow? Did Sarah help with expenses? Had we made investment decisions lately? Red flags were multiplying like rabbits, but I kept my voice sweet and answers vague. "We're managing fine, thank you." "I'm sure you are," he said with that practiced smile. "But if you ever want opportunities to make your money work harder, I'd happily review your portfolio. Family rates, of course." Family rates. We'd known each other 3 hours. When Sarah returned with my famous apple pie, Brad transformed back into devoted boyfriend. The man was a chameleon, and I suspected we weren't seeing his true colors. After they left, I stood washing dishes and trying to identify what bothered me about Brad Thompson. On paper, he was everything a mother wants for her daughter. Polite, charming, crazy about Sarah, financially stable, but I trust my instincts, and they were screaming that Brad Thompson was performing, not being himself. The question was, what was he hiding? As I dried the last plate, I decided to pay closer attention to Mr. Perfect. In my experience, men who seem too good to be true usually are. 6 months later, I'd be sitting in church listening to that charming man confess my daughter meant nothing more than a paycheck. Second dinner, Brad brought wine that cost more than my weekly groceries. Not complaining about good wine, but another puzzle piece that didn't fit his supposed income level. "This is lovely, Brad," I said, examining the Bordeaux that was probably older than Sarah. "Special occasion?" "Every dinner with your family is special, Mrs. Harrison," he replied smoothly. Politicians answer. "Sounds nice, says nothing." Sarah beamed like he'd recited Shakespeare. My daughter, who has a marketing master's and can spot sales pitches from orbit, was completely buying whatever Brad was selling. Love makes you stupid. During dinner, Brad shared work stories about helping high-net-worth individuals manage portfolios. He dropped investment firm names and mentioned clients with multiple homes and luxury cars. Sounded impressive and completely vague. "So who exactly employs you?" I asked, cutting through the charm. "I'm independent," he said smoothly. "Gives me flexibility to focus on individual client needs." Translation: he didn't work for anyone legitimate, and there was no way to verify his stories. But Sarah nodded like he'd explained quantum physics. While they admired my roses outside, I did what any sensible mother does: Googled him. Brad Thompson Investment Consulting returned millions of results, none matching our Brad. Added Cedar Ridge, got nothing. No business license, no professional certifications, no LinkedIn matching his description. For someone supposedly working with wealthy clients, Brad Thompson had remarkably little online presence, either very professional or very suspicious. When they returned, I was innocently sipping tea in my living room. "Mom," Sarah said, settling beside Brad with that particular glow, meaning news. "Brad and I think it's time for me to change my investment strategy." My tea paused mid-sip. "What changes?" Brad leaned forward with earnest concern. "Sarah mentioned she's keeping her inheritance in traditional savings. With inflation and market volatility, she's losing money yearly." Not wrong. But something about his delivery triggered my mother radar. "I'm assembling a conservative portfolio," Brad continued. "Nothing risky, just diversified funds and stable growth opportunities." "Sounds wonderful," I said neutrally. Sarah's always been money smart. What I thought: why is my daughter's 6-week boyfriend suddenly managing her finances? What I said: "I'm sure you'll make good decisions, honey. Because here's motherhood truth. Sometimes you must let adult children make their own mistakes, even when you see disaster approaching." Over following months, Brad became a fixture. Every family dinner, holiday celebration, community event Sarah attended. Charming to neighbors, helpful around the house, devoted to Sarah, surface-perfect boyfriend. But I noticed things. Casual questions about our finances, interest in David's inheritance details, Sarah's trust fund, our major purchases. Framed as concern, felt like reconnaissance. Then inconsistencies. Brad claimed Connecticut upbringing, but didn't know basic state facts any native would. Said Yale graduate, but couldn't name his freshman dorm. Mentioned wealthy background, but had working-class tells no polish could hide. I started mental lists of Brad's stories, checking consistency. They weren't. But Sarah was happier than since David died. Sleeping better, laughing more, discussing future plans. If Brad made her that happy, was I playing suspicious mother-in-law based on feelings? Answer: absolutely. Those feelings were about to prove very accurate. 6 months in, Sarah announced they were moving together. Brad found a great deal on a house across town. Rental supposedly perfect for testing domestic life. "Beautiful place, Mom," Sarah gushed, showing phone pictures. "Brad knows the landlord, so we're getting way below market rate." Looking at clearly expensive home photos, I wondered how Brad secured such a deal. But I smiled and said I was happy. That night, alone for the first time in months without Sarah and Brad's laughter-filling rooms, I decided to discover exactly who Brad Thompson really was. My daughter might be love-blinded, but I wasn't. Something about Brad's too-perfect performance was setting off every alarm I possessed. Time for real detective work. 3 months after Sarah moved in with Brad, they announced engagement at my Sunday dinner table. I should have been thrilled. Sarah glowed, the ring was gorgeous, Brad seemed happy. Instead, I felt like watching a performance. "Mom, look!" Sarah practically shoved her hand in my face, where a stunning solitaire caught light. At least 2 carats, definitely real. "Beautiful, honey," I said honestly. The ring was lovely, also expensive, more than someone claiming independent investment consulting should afford. Brad beamed proudly. "I wanted something worthy of Sarah," he said, gazing into her eyes like they were alone. "She deserves the best." The romantic in me melted. The mother in me wondered where he'd gotten money for a ring, probably costing more than my car. "How did you find something so perfect?" I asked innocently. "Friend in jewelry business," Brad said smoothly. Great deal on a stone returned by another customer. Another great deal. Brad had remarkably lucky connections with people offering expensive discounts. Either incredibly fortunate or something else happening. But Sarah radiated happiness, so I hugged them both and opened good champagne I'd saved for special occasions. We toasted their future while I ignored the warning voice in my head. Over following weeks, wedding planning consumed Sarah's life. She approached details with marketing campaign intensity, creating spreadsheets for everything from flowers to seating charts. Brad was the perfect, supportive fiancé, agreeing with choices and suggesting helpful vendors offering deals. Brad knows someone doing catering for half price, Sarah told me excitedly during planning sessions. And his friend gets wholesale flowers. I started thinking Brad Thompson knew many people willing to work below market rates, either incredibly well-connected or incredibly good at finding people participating in something shady. Meanwhile, I'd hired a private investigator, Patricia from my book club. Patricia had been discreet about researching Brad's background, and her findings were interesting. No record of Brad Thompson attending Yale, no Connecticut upbringing records, no business license for his investment firm. Credit history only went back 3 years. Employment history suspiciously vague. Most interesting, a Bradford Thompson had been arrested in Nevada 2 years ago for investment fraud. Same age, similar description, but charges dropped when victims suddenly refused testifying. Patricia couldn't prove same person, but the coincidence troubled me. Unfortunately, coincidences aren't proof, and I couldn't present Sarah with maybe it's him mugshots, expecting wedding cancellation. I needed more evidence, so I decided paying closer attention to Brad's behavior to discover more. What I discovered, Brad Thompson was excellent at asking right questions. During family dinners, he'd casually steer conversations toward our finances. How much were David's patents worth? Had I considered refinancing for low rates? Was Sarah maximizing retirement contributions? He framed everything as helpful concern, but I noticed he was building comprehensive pictures of our family assets, particularly interested in Sarah's inheritance. You know, he said one evening while Sarah used the bathroom. Sarah mentioned she's been conservative with investments. With the wedding coming and our future ahead, maybe time for more aggressive portfolio management. Aggressive how? I asked conversationally. I'm developing a real estate investment opportunity. Nothing risky, just commercial property likely to appreciate significantly over coming years. Sarah could get in early. Sounds complicated, I said. Sarah prefers simple investments. That's exactly the problem, Brad said earnestly. Simple investments don't build real wealth. Sarah's smart, but she's played too safe. With proper guidance, her inheritance could double in 5 years. Or disappear entirely, I thought. But I said, I'm sure you'll figure out what's best. Wedding was set for June, giving me 3 months to determine what Brad Thompson was really planning. 3 months to decide whether I was paranoid or my instincts were trying to save my daughter from life's biggest mistake. Here's what 55 years taught me. When someone seems too good to be true, has answers for everything, and their story has truck-sized holes, they're usually hiding something big. Question was, what was Brad hiding, and how much damage would he do before I proved it? Wedding planning brings out people's best and worst, and Brad Thompson was no exception. Closer to June, the more controlling he became about details. Not obviously alarming Sarah, but subtle ways that made my skin crawl. I really think we should use my friend's catering company, he'd say when Sarah mentioned other options. They're giving us such a good deal, and I've worked with them before. Or, my photographer friend understands the shots we want. We don't want risks with someone new. Slowly, Brad steered Sarah toward vendors he'd personally selected. Every wedding aspect was being handled by people with some Brad relationship. That's not romantic planning. That's controlling behavior with pretty bows. Meanwhile, investigator Patricia had been busy. She'd tracked down 2 Nevada women who'd had relationships with someone matching Brad's description around those investment fraud charges. Both lost significant money, both too embarrassed to press charges when their boyfriend disappeared. Patterns almost identical, Patricia told me during our bookstore coffee meeting. Charming man appears, becomes perfect boyfriend, gains financial access, vanishes with everything portable. But he's marrying Sarah, I pointed out. Why go through marriage trouble if he's planning to disappear? Maybe marriage gives legal access to more money, Patricia suggested. Or maybe he's planning longer cons. Get married, control finances, then disappear once he's cleaned out everything possible. The thought sickened me, but it explained Brad's behavior. He wasn't just dating Sarah. He was positioning himself to take everything she had. I needed proof, not suspicions and coincidences, but actual evidence convincing Sarah her perfect fiancé was fraud. Problem was, Brad was excellent at covering tracks. That's when I developed a plan, either brilliant or completely insane. I decided testing Brad's story by arranging surprise encounters with his supposed past. If he really grew up wealthy in Connecticut, really attended Yale, really worked high-end finance, he should handle meeting someone from that world. I called college roommate Helen, who'd married well and lived in Greenwich, Connecticut. Helen was old money, the type who'd actually know families and institutions Brad claimed association with. "I need a favor," I told Helen. "Can you visit next month and meet Sarah's fiancé? I want a second opinion." Helen agreed, and we arranged her to surprise me during one of Brad and Sarah's regular Sunday dinners. The Sunday Helen arrived, I watched Brad's face carefully when I introduced her as my Greenwich college friend. For just a moment, something flickered across his expression. Panic? Calculation? Before the charming smile returned. "Greenwich," Brad said enthusiastically. "Beautiful area. I have family friends there. Do you know the Hamiltons? They live near the yacht club." Helen smiled politely. "Greenwich isn't that small." "Dear, but I've been yacht club member 30 years. Which Hamiltons?" I watched Brad's smile tighten imperceptibly. "Family friends of my parents. I don't know them personally well." Smooth recovery, but Helen wasn't finished. "And you attended Yale?" Sarah mentioned. "What residential college?" "Pearson," Brad said without hesitation. "Lovely. My nephew graduated Pearson recently. What year did you graduate?" Brad rattled off a year, and Helen nodded thoughtfully. "You might have known my nephew. Tommy Whitfield?" "Name sounds familiar," Brad said carefully. Helen's smile was perfectly pleasant. "That's funny, because Tommy attended Princeton, not Yale, and I've never had a nephew." Silence could have been cut with knives. Sarah looked confused, Brad looked like he was calculating escape routes, and I looked like Christmas morning arrived early. "I must have misheard the name," Brad attempted laughing off. "You know family connections. Everyone knows everyone. But details get confused." "Of course," Helen said sweetly. "Easy to get confused about these things." After Brad and Sarah left, Helen and I sat in my kitchen with wine, dissecting the encounter. "That man's never been within 50 miles of Greenwich society," Helen said firmly, "and definitely didn't attend Yale. He might have studied school catalogs, but never actually been there. So what do I do with that information? Sarah won't believe me based on one uncomfortable conversation." "Get more evidence," Helen suggested. "Set more traps. If he's lying about background, he's probably lying about other things." She was right. I had 2 months until wedding to prove it. What I didn't know, Brad had already started cleaning out Sarah's accounts. 2 months before the wedding, Sarah casually mentioned during shopping that she and Brad had made exciting investment decisions with her inheritance money. "We found this amazing opportunity," she said, holding up a bridesmaid dress. "Brad's been working on it for months, and we finally got approved." My blood froze. "What kind of investment?" "Private real estate development. Luxury condos in Colorado Springs. Brad says returns could be incredible, and since we're marrying anyway, it made sense starting our future together." I managed steady voice. "How much did you invest?" "Most of it," Sarah said casually, still focused on the dress. "About $400,000, but Brad says we could double that in 2 years. $400,000. Sarah's entire inheritance from David gone in one investment decision with a man whose background I couldn't verify. "Sarah," I said carefully, "did a lawyer review the investment documents?" "Brad handled everything," she said, finally looking at me. "Mom, why are you making that face? You look sick." Because I was sick. My daughter had just handed her life savings to someone I increasingly believed was a con artist, based solely on his word. "I think it's important being careful with large investments," I said. "Maybe someone independent should review the paperwork." Sarah's expression shifted to mild irritation. "Mom, Brad's a professional. This is what he does. I trust him." Trust. The word con artists count on more than anything. That night, I called Patricia, asking her to dig deeper into Brad's supposed real estate deal. If Sarah invested $400,000, there should be documentation somewhere. Patricia's findings made my worst fears look optimistic. "There's no record of any real estate development matching the description," she told me. "The company Brad supposedly used doesn't exist. The property address leads to an empty lot that's been for sale 5 years. So where's the money? Based on bank records I accessed, it went into a Brad-controlled account, then immediately transferred to multiple offshore accounts. The money's gone. Margaret, all of it. I sat in my kitchen, staring at wedding invitation proofs Sarah had left on my counter, trying to process what I'd learned. Brad Thompson had stolen my daughter's inheritance, and she had no idea. Wedding was 8 weeks away. 8 weeks to figure out exposing Brad without destroying Sarah. I considered police, but what could I tell them? That my daughter voluntarily gave money to her fiancé for an investment that turned out fake. Unless I could prove Brad deliberately defrauded her, it would look like business deals gone wrong. I considered confronting Brad directly, but that would give him time disappearing before the wedding. Somehow, I was becoming convinced the wedding itself was part of his plan. If Brad married Sarah, he'd have legal access to more assets. Her retirement accounts, her portion of my estate when I died, anything she inherited or earned during marriage. The wedding wasn't his con's end, just the next phase, which meant I had to stop it. But how do you convince someone the man they love is criminal when they're wearing his ring and planning their future? I decided setting one more trap. If Brad was the con artist type, I thought he wouldn't resist opportunities for more money, especially if he thought he was about to gain permanent family resource access through marriage. So I started dropping hints about fictional inheritance I was supposedly expecting from a distant relative. Nothing obvious, just casual mentions of paperwork I was handling and lawyer phone calls. Aunt Ruth was always the family eccentric, I told Sarah and Brad during dinner. I never expected her remembering me in her will. But apparently, she left me something significant. Lawyers say it could be substantial. Brad's interest was immediate and intense. Wonderful news, Mrs. Harrison. Unexpected inheritances can really change financial pictures. Lawyers want meeting next week discussing details, I continued. Something about tax implications and investment strategies. I'd be happy reviewing any documents, Brad offered smoothly. These situations can be complex, and you want ensuring you're making right decisions. There it was. Brad Thompson offering to help me manage money that didn't exist. Over following weeks, I fed Brad carefully constructed details about my fake inheritance. The amount grew in my stories, and his interest grew along with it. He started asking pointed questions about estate planning, whether I'd updated my will recently, how I was thinking about leaving assets to Sarah. You know, he said one evening, after Sarah and I marry, it might make sense consolidating some financial planning. Family trusts can be very tax efficient. Family trusts controlled by Brad, no doubt. The wedding was 4 weeks away when I finally decided what I had to do. Time to set the ultimate trap. 3 weeks before the wedding, I did something making me either the best mother in the world or the most devious. I planted a listening device in Brad's car. Before judging me, let me explain. Patricia had law enforcement contacts, and one specialized in surveillance equipment. A tiny recording device, completely undetectable, that would pick up Brad's BMW conversations. This is probably illegal, Patricia warned, showing me how the device worked. So is stealing $400,000 from my daughter, I replied. I'm willing to take risks. I figured if Brad was really planning to con Sarah, he'd eventually discuss it with someone. Maybe his real partner, maybe another victim, maybe just phone calls arranging exit strategies. The device would record everything, giving me proof I needed to save Sarah. For 2 weeks, I listened to the most boring recordings imaginable. Brad talking to vendors about wedding details, mundane phone conversations with unidentifiable people, singing along to radio. Either he was the most innocent man alive or very careful about where he had sensitive conversations. Then, a week before the wedding, I hit jackpot. Brad was having lunch with someone called Danny, and their conversation was very enlightening. You sure about the timeline? Danny asked. Seems like you're cutting it close. Wedding's next Saturday, Brad replied. Soon as we're legally married, I'll have access to everything. Trust accounts, retirement funds, plus whatever the old lady leaves her when she dies. What about the $400 you already got? That's just appetizer, Brad laughed. Real money comes after marriage. Give me 6 months cleaning out everything I can access. Then I'll file for divorce and disappear. She'll be too embarrassed coming after me seriously. And if she figures it out before then? She won't. Sarah's completely under spell. She thinks I'm Prince Charming, and her mother's just suspicious old bat. By the time either realizes what's happening, I'll be long gone with everything they have. I sat in my kitchen, listening to my daughter's fiancé calmly discussing how he planned destroying her life, and felt rage unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Brad Thompson was about to learn what happens when you mess with a mother's child. But I needed more than recordings. I needed to catch him in the act, in front of witnesses, leaving no doubt about his intentions. Wedding was 6 days away. 6 days to orchestrate the downfall of a professional con artist who thought he was smarter than everyone else. I spent the next 3 days making careful preparations. First, I called Patricia, asking her to contact police friends about potentially arresting someone at a wedding. Then I called the venue asking about security procedures. Finally, I made a specific request to the ceremony minister. I need you prepared for unusual circumstances during the wedding, I told Reverend Mitchell. There may be interruptions, and I need you to delay the ceremony if necessary. Reverend Mitchell had known our family for years and trusted my judgment enough to agree without asking too many questions. The night before the wedding, I called Sarah checking final preparations. I'm so nervous. Mom, she said, voice bubbling with excitement, but also so happy. I can't believe tomorrow I'll be Mrs. Thompson. Are you sure about this, honey? I asked one last time. Marriage is a big step. I've never been more sure of anything, Sarah said firmly. Brad is everything I've ever wanted in a husband. I'm the luckiest woman alive. My heart broke slightly, knowing what I was about to do to her. But better a broken heart than a destroyed life. I love you, Sarah, I said. Whatever happens tomorrow, remember that everything I do is because I love you. I love you too, Mom. You're going to love being Brad's mother-in-law. He thinks the world of you. If only she knew what Brad really thought of both of us. Wedding morning dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for what was about to become the most dramatic ceremony in Cedar Ridge history. I got dressed carefully, choosing an outfit appropriate for both weddings and courtrooms. Then I drove to the church, carrying my purse with the recording device inside and a cell phone programmed with the direct number for Detective Morrison, the police contact Patricia had arranged. Sarah looked beautiful in her wedding dress, radiant with happiness, about to be shattered. Brad looked handsome in his tuxedo, every inch the devoted groom. If I hadn't heard his conversation with Danny, I might have thought I was wrong about everything. But I had heard it, and in a few hours, everyone else would too. The wedding day atmosphere was magazine perfect. Cedar Ridge Community Church had been transformed with white roses and golden ribbons. Guests arriving in their finest clothes. Sarah was in the bridal suite finishing makeup, while I sat in the front pew, trying to calm nerves and review my plan. At 3:45, 15 minutes before ceremony start, I excused myself to use the restroom. What I actually did was walk around to the church side where Brad's BMW was parked with other wedding party cars. That's where I found Brad having a phone conversation confirming everything I'd suspected about his character. Danny, it's me, Brad was saying into his cell phone, obviously thinking he was far enough from church that no one would overhear. Yeah, in about 20 minutes, I'll officially be married to my retirement fund. He laughed at whatever Danny said in response. Trust me, this girl is so naive she'll sign anything I put in front of her. I've already got her to put most of her money into that fake investment. Once we're married, I'll have access to her retirement accounts, and I can start working on the mother's assets, too. My blood pressure spiked, but I kept listening. The old lady's got a house worth at least $300,000, plus whatever she's got in savings. Sarah mentioned life insurance money, too. Give me 6 months and I can clean out everything they have. What if they get suspicious? Danny asked. I could hear him clearly because Brad had the phone on speaker, thinking he was alone. They won't. Sarah thinks I walk on water, and even if the mother starts asking questions, who's going to believe I'm a con artist? I've got references, business cards, the whole setup. By the time anyone figures out what's happening, I'll be in another state with a new identity. And you're sure about the timeline? After ceremony, we're having photos, then reception. I'll make sure to have conversations with the mother about helping her with finances now that I'm officially family. Plant seeds early, you know? Then tomorrow we're off on honeymoon, and when we get back, I can really start working on consolidating their assets. I'd heard enough, more than enough. I pulled out my phone and started recording, capturing the rest of Brad's conversation as evidence. The best part is, Brad continued, Sarah's so desperate to be married that she'd probably forgive me even if she did find out. Her dad died when she was young, and she's got major abandonment issues. She'll do anything to keep from being alone again. That's when I stopped recording and started seeing red. Talking about stealing our money was one thing, but psychoanalyzing my daughter's vulnerabilities while planning to exploit them? Brad Thompson had just crossed a line he couldn't come back from. I walked back into the church and took my seat, checking my phone to ensure the recording was saved. Then I sent a text to Detective Morrison. "It's happening. Come now." At exactly 4 o'clock, the organist began playing processional music. Bridesmaids walked down the aisle in pale pink dresses, followed by the maid of honor. Then the music changed to traditional wedding march, and Sarah appeared at the church back. She looked absolutely beautiful and absolutely happy. For a moment, I wondered if I was making life's biggest mistake. What if I was wrong? What if Brad really loved her, and I was about to destroy my daughter's happiness based on misunderstood conversations and circumstantial evidence? Then I remembered the cold calculation in Brad's voice when he'd talked about exploiting Sarah's abandonment issues, and my resolve hardened. My daughter deserved better than a man who saw her vulnerabilities as opportunities. Sarah walked down the aisle on her godfather's arm, since her own father couldn't be there to give her away. She was glowing with happiness, and when she reached the altar and took Brad's hand, the love in her eyes was unmistakable. Brad was playing devoted groom perfectly. He looked appropriately nervous and deeply moved, and when Sarah reached him, he whispered something, making her smile. Reverend Mitchell began ceremony with traditional words. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the joining of Sarah Elizabeth Harrison and Bradford Michael Thompson in holy matrimony." I listened to familiar words and watched Brad's performance, knowing that in just minutes, everything was going to change. Ceremony proceeded normally through readings and homily. Sarah and Brad exchanged vows they'd written themselves. Sarah's heartfelt and genuine, while Brad's were perfectly crafted to sound romantic while committing to nothing specific. Then came ring exchange, and I could see we were approaching the moment I'd been waiting for. "If anyone present knows of any reason why this couple should not be joined in marriage," Reverend Mitchell said, reaching the traditional ceremony point, "let them speak now or forever hold their peace." This was it. My moment. I started to stand up, heart pounding, ready to play the recording that would expose Brad for what he really was. But before I could say anything, Brad's best man, a nervous-looking guy I'd never met before today, grabbed Brad's arm and whispered something urgently in his ear. And that's when everything changed. What Brad's best man whispered was, "Dude, there are cops outside. Like, a lot of cops." I could see Brad's face change, the charming groom mask slipping for just a moment to reveal the calculating predator underneath. His eyes quickly scanned the congregation, and when they landed on me, I saw recognition and fury flash across his features. He knew. Somehow he'd figured out that I was responsible for whatever was happening outside. "Is there a problem?" Reverend Mitchell asked, noticing the disruption. "No problem at all," Brad said smoothly, but I could see sweat beading on his forehead. "Just wedding day nerves." That's when I stood up. "Actually, Reverend Mitchell, there is a problem," I said loudly enough for the entire congregation to hear. "I have something very important that everyone needs to know about the groom." The church went completely silent. Sarah's face went white, and she stared at me in shock and confusion. "Mom?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. "What are you doing?" "I'm saving you from making the biggest mistake of your life, honey," I said, pulling out my phone. "Everyone here needs to hear what your fiancé really thinks about this marriage." Brad took a step toward me, his charming facade completely gone now. "Mrs. Harrison, I think you're having some kind of episode. Maybe you should sit down." "The only episode I'm having is a sudden attack of honesty," I replied. "Which is more than I can say for you, Bradley Wilson." The use of his real name hit Brad like a physical blow. Several guests gasped, and Sarah looked back and forth between us in confusion. "I don't know what you think you know," Brad said, but his voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "I know that your real name is Bradley Wilson, not Bradford Thompson," I announced to the congregation. "I know that you've been running marriage cons for years, targeting women with money and disappearing after you clean out their accounts." "That's ridiculous," Brad said, but he was looking around the church like a trapped animal. I know that you convinced my daughter to invest $400,000 in a fake real estate development, and that money is already gone, I continued. Sarah made a small, wounded sound, and I saw her hand go to her throat. And I know, I said, raising my phone, because I have a recording of you explaining your entire plan to your partner. That's when Brad panicked. Instead of trying to deny it or talk his way out of the situation, he made a run for it. Right there at the altar, in front of 200 wedding guests, the groom hiked up his tuxedo and bolted for the side door of the church. Unfortunately for Brad, Detective Morrison and 2 other officers were waiting right outside that door. The congregation erupted into chaos as sounds of shouting and struggle came from outside the church. Sarah sank into a chair, her beautiful wedding dress pooling around her, staring at the doors where her fiancé had just disappeared. "Mom," she said, her voice broken, "what just happened? I don't understand what just happened." I sat down beside her and took her hands. "I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry. But Brad wasn't who he said he was. He was never who he said he was. The investment money," Sarah whispered. "Is it really gone?" I nodded and watched my daughter's world crumble in real time. Reverend Mitchell took control of the situation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the confused congregation, "there's obviously been a serious situation here today. I'm going to ask everyone to please move to the fellowship hall while we sort things out." Most guests filed out, buzzing with shock and confusion. Sarah's maid of honor, her cousin Lisa, stayed with us, along with a few close family friends. Detective Morrison came back into the church a few minutes later. "Mrs. Harrison, I'm Detective Morrison. We spoke on the phone." "Is he under arrest?" I asked. "He's in custody," the detective confirmed. "We'll need statements from both you and your daughter, but based on the evidence you've provided and what we've discovered about his previous activities, he's going to be charged with multiple counts of fraud." Sarah looked up at the detective with tears streaming down her face. "How much trouble am I in?" "I gave him the money willingly." "You're not in trouble," Detective Morrison said gently. "You're a victim of fraud. The fact that you gave him money doesn't make it legal if he obtained it through false pretenses." "What happens now?" Sarah asked. "Now we build a case against him," the detective explained, "and we try to recover as much of your money as possible. Mr. Wilson has been on our radar for a while. You're not his first victim, but with your mother's evidence, you might be his last." As the detective left to continue his investigation, I sat with my daughter in the empty church, surrounded by white roses and shattered dreams. "How did you know?" Sarah asked quietly. "Mother's intuition," I said, "and a very good private investigator." "How long have you known?" "I suspected from the beginning," I admitted. "I've been investigating him for months." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "The money Dad left me, it's really all gone?" "Most of it," I said. "But honey, money can be replaced. You can't." The aftermath of the wedding that wasn't became the biggest story Cedar Ridge had seen in decades. By Monday morning, everyone in town knew that Sarah Harrison's fiancé had been arrested at the altar for fraud, and the gossip mill was working overtime. I'd expected judgment and whispers, but what I got instead was an outpouring of support that reminded me why I loved small-town living. Neighbors brought casseroles, friends offered shoulders to cry on, and even people I barely knew stopped by to express sympathy and admiration for exposing Brad before it was too late. "You did the right thing, Margaret," my neighbor Dorothy told me as she helped clean up wedding gifts that would need returning. "That girl is lucky to have a mother who pays attention." Sarah was staying with me for a few days while she processed everything that had happened. She'd been remarkably calm, considering her world had imploded. But I could see pain in her eyes every time she looked at her wedding dress hanging in the guest room. Detective Morrison called Tuesday with an update. "We've made significant progress on the case," he told me. "Bradley Wilson has been using multiple identities for at least 5 years, and we've identified 7 other victims in 4 different states." "7 other women like Sarah?" I asked. "All with similar patterns. He targets women who've recently inherited money or gone through divorces with substantial settlements. Always the perfect boyfriend, always pushing for quick marriages, always disappearing once he's gotten access to their finances." "How much money are we talking about? Total damages across all victims?" "Over $2 million. Your daughter's case is actually one of the larger individual thefts. The number made me sick. Brad had stolen Sarah's inheritance like it was pocket change, and he'd been doing it to other women for years. What are the chances of recovery? I asked. Better than usual. Actually, because you caught him before he could disappear completely, we've been able to freeze several accounts. We won't recover everything, but we might get back 60 or 70%. It was better than nothing, but it still meant Sarah had lost over $100,000 to a man who'd never loved her. Wednesday, Patricia stopped by with additional information she'd uncovered about Brad's background. His real name is Bradley Wilson, and he's 34 years old, she told Sarah and me as we sat in my living room. He grew up in foster care in Nevada, dropped out of high school, and has a history of small-time cons going back to when he was 18. So, everything about his background was fake? Sarah asked. Everything. No wealthy family, no Yale education, no successful business. He learned to imitate upper-class behavior by studying it online and practicing on smaller targets before moving up to bigger cons. How did he know so much about investments and finance? I asked. He didn't really, Patricia explained. He learned enough terminology to sound impressive, but if you'd asked him detailed questions, his knowledge was very shallow. He counted on charm and confidence to carry him through. Sarah shook her head. I can't believe I fell for it. Don't blame yourself, Patricia said firmly. Bradley Wilson was very good at what he did. He studied psychology, learned how to identify and exploit emotional vulnerabilities. This wasn't your fault. Thursday, I got a call that surprised me. It was from one of Brad's other victims, a woman named Helen Morrison from Portland. Detective Morrison gave me your contact information, Helen explained. I wanted to thank you for stopping him. If you hadn't caught him when you did, he would have moved on to target more women. How much did he steal from you? I asked. $60,000. I thought I was investing in a wine importing business with the man I was going to marry. Helen's voice was bitter. He disappeared the night before our wedding, and I never saw him again. I'm so sorry. Don't be sorry. Be proud. You did what none of the rest of us could do. You stopped him. Your daughter is lucky to have you. After I hung up, I thought about Helen and the other victims. Sarah wasn't just one person who'd been hurt by Brad's lies. She was part of a pattern of women whose lives had been damaged by a predator who saw their love as a business opportunity. Friday, exactly 1 week after the wedding disaster, Detective Morrison called with news about Brad's arraignment. He's been charged with 7 counts of fraud in multiple jurisdictions, the detective told me. His public defender is trying to work out a plea deal, but with the evidence we have, he's looking at significant prison time. How significant? Probably 8 to 12 years, depending on how much cooperation he provides about any accomplices. It wasn't enough. No amount of prison time would compensate for what he'd put Sarah and the other women through. But it was something. That evening, Sarah and I sat on my back porch, watching the sunset and talking about the future. I keep thinking about what Detective Morrison said, Sarah told me. About Brad studying psychology to exploit people's vulnerabilities. What vulnerabilities did he see in me? It was a hard question, but an important one. You wanted to be loved, I said gently. You wanted someone to build a life with. Those aren't weaknesses, honey. Those are normal human desires. But I was so naive. I gave him access to everything without asking enough questions. You trusted someone you thought you loved. That's what people do in relationships. How do I ever trust anyone again? Sarah asked, and I could hear the fear in her voice. Carefully, I said. But you do trust again. Because the alternative is spending your life alone, and that's not living, that's just existing. Sometimes being a mother means protecting your child from obvious dangers. Sometimes it means protecting them from dangers they can't see coming. Charming men who lie as easily as breathing. I'd done my job. My daughter was safe, and Bradley Wilson was going to prison. 6 months after the wedding disaster, life had settled into a new normal. Sarah had moved back into her own apartment and was seeing a therapist to work through the emotional trauma of Brad's betrayal. She'd also started dating again, very cautiously, and with ground rules that included background checks for anyone she got serious about. I know it sounds paranoid, she told me over lunch one Tuesday, but after what happened with Brad, I'm not taking any chances. It's not paranoid, I assured her. It's smart. There's nothing wrong with verifying that someone is who they claim to be. The financial recovery had been better than expected. Between frozen accounts and assets that Brad hadn't had time to move, we'd recovered about $250,000 of the $400,000 he'd stolen. It wasn't everything, but it was enough for Sarah to rebuild her financial security. Brad himself had pleaded guilty to multiple fraud charges and been sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. His accomplice Danny had also been arrested and was serving a shorter sentence in exchange for his cooperation. 10 years isn't enough, Sarah had said when we heard the sentence. No, I'd agreed, but it's what we got, and at least other women won't have to go through what you did. The trial had been a media sensation, with reporters fascinated by the story of the con artist who'd been exposed at his own wedding. Several news programs had interviewed us, and I'd become something of a minor celebrity as the mother who'd saved her daughter from a marriage fraud. "You're famous, Mrs. Harrison," the grocery store clerk told me when a tabloid at the checkout featured a photo of me with the headline, "Super Mom Saves Daughter from Wedding Day Con Man." "Famous for being suspicious," I replied. Not sure that's the kind of fame I wanted, but the attention had led to something unexpected and worthwhile. I'd been contacted by several organizations that help fraud victims, and I'd started volunteering to speak at seminars about romance scams and how to protect yourself from them. The most important thing to remember, I would tell audiences, is that love shouldn't make you stupid. If someone is pressuring you to make financial decisions quickly, if their background doesn't check out, if your family and friends are expressing concerns, pay attention to those red flags. Sarah had started coming to some of the seminars with me, sharing her own experience to help other women recognize the warning signs. "I thought I was smart enough not to fall for something like this," she would say. "But con artists are professionals. They study psychology, they practice their techniques, and they're very good at what they do. The key is verification. Check their story, check their background, and don't let anyone rush you into major decisions." The seminars were therapeutic for both of us, turning our painful experience into something that could help other people avoid similar trauma. One evening in December, almost exactly a year after Brad had first appeared in our lives, Sarah and I were decorating my Christmas tree when she brought up something that had been on my mind too. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you think Dad would have seen through Brad's act?" I considered the question carefully. David had been a good judge of character, but he'd also been more trusting than I was. "I think your dad would have asked more questions about Brad's work," I said finally. As an engineer, he was always interested in details, and Brad's explanations about his business were very vague. Dad might have pushed for specifics that would have exposed the lies. "I miss him," Sarah said quietly. "I keep thinking that if he'd been alive, none of this would have happened." "Maybe not. But you can't live your life wondering what might have been different. What matters is that we got through it, and we stopped Brad from hurting anyone else." "I'm proud of you, you know," Sarah said, hanging an ornament on the tree, "for trusting your instincts, even when everyone thought you were being overprotective." "I'm proud of you too," I replied, "for surviving something that would have destroyed a lot of people, and for turning it into a way to help others." As we continued decorating, I thought about how much had changed in the past year. Sarah was stronger now, more cautious, but not bitter. I discovered that I was capable of playing amateur detective when necessary. And we'd both learned that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who look like Prince Charming. "You know what?" Sarah said suddenly. "What?" "I'm glad it happened." I stared at her in surprise. "You're glad you almost married a con artist?" "No, I'm glad you caught him before I actually married him. And I'm glad we learned what we're capable of when we need to protect each other." She was right. As painful as the experience had been, it had also shown us both that we were stronger than we'd known. "Just promise me one thing," I said. "What's that?" "When you do get married, to someone whose background we've thoroughly investigated, let's have a very quiet, very small ceremony." "Deal," Sarah said, "but I reserve the right to invite at least one reporter, just in case we need a witness to another arrest." We both laughed, and I realized that we were going to be okay. 2 years later, I was sitting in the same church where Sarah's wedding disaster had unfolded. But this time, the atmosphere was genuinely joyful. Sarah was getting married again, to David Martinez, a teacher she'd met at one of our fraud prevention seminars. Unlike Brad, David had been thoroughly vetted by both me and the private investigator I'd kept on retainer. His background checks out completely, Patricia had assured me after her investigation. Born in Cedar Ridge, went to State University, been teaching at the same high school for 8 years. No secret identities, no mysterious financial dealings, no history of fraud. He's exactly who he says he is. Almost suspiciously normal, I'd joked, but I was relieved. David had proposed after a year of dating, but not before sitting down with me for what he called the interrogation. "Mrs. Harrison," he'd said during a family dinner, "I know that Sarah's previous experience has made this family cautious about trusting people. I want you to know that I understand that, and I'm prepared to answer any questions you have about my background, my finances, my intentions, or anything else you want to know." I'd appreciated his directness, and over the following months, I'd come to genuinely like David. He was kind, funny, and clearly devoted to Sarah. More importantly, he understood what she'd been through and was patient with her lingering trust issues. The new wedding was everything Sarah's first attempt hadn't been: small, intimate, and absolutely authentic. 30 guests instead of 200, wildflowers instead of exotic arrangements, and a groom who was genuinely nervous instead of performing nervousness. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Mitchell began, and I felt my shoulders tense automatically. The last time I'd heard those words in this church, they'd been followed by one of the most dramatic scenes in Cedar Ridge history. But this time, when Reverend Mitchell reached the part about objections, I remained seated and silent. No one interrupted. No one ran for the exits, and no police officers appeared. David and Sarah exchanged rings and vows that they'd written themselves, and when Reverend Mitchell pronounced them husband and wife, the only surprise was how perfectly normal everything was. At the reception, held in my backyard with catering from the local deli, I found myself talking to Detective Morrison, who'd become something of a family friend after the Brad Wilson case. "Any word on how our favorite con artist is doing in prison?" I asked. "Brad's been a model prisoner, apparently," Detective Morrison said. "He's teaching financial literacy classes to other inmates, which I find ironically appropriate. Teaching them how to steal money? Teaching them how to manage money legally. Actually, turns out he really did learn a lot about finance during his con artist years. The warden says he's quite good at it." "Think he's actually reformed?" Detective Morrison shrugged. "Hard to say. Con artists are good at playing whatever role they think will benefit them. But he's got 7 more years to figure out who he wants to be when he gets out." Later in the evening, as the reception was winding down, Sarah pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Mom, I need to tell you something." "What's that?" "I got a letter from Brad last month." I felt my blood pressure spike. "He contacted you from prison? Is that even legal?" "It's allowed, apparently. He wanted to apologize." And I wrote him back. I stared at my daughter in shock. "You wrote back to the man who tried to steal your life savings?" "I told him I forgave him," Sarah said calmly. "Not because he deserved forgiveness, but because carrying that anger was hurting me more than it was hurting him." I thought about that for a moment. "How do you feel now?" "Free," Sarah said simply. "For the first time since all this happened, I feel completely free of it." I looked across the yard at David, who was helping clean up tables and chatting easily with our neighbors, and I understood what Sarah meant. The Brad Wilson chapter of our lives was finally, truly closed. "You know what I realized today?" Sarah continued. "What?" "Brad actually did me a favor." I raised an eyebrow. "How do you figure that?" "If I'd married him, I would have spent years in a fake marriage with someone who didn't actually love me. Instead, I'm married to someone who knows exactly who I am and loves me anyway. Someone who thinks my paranoia about background checks is endearing rather than annoying." "When you put it that way, I suppose Brad did do us all a favor," I said. "Though I still think 10 years in prison wasn't enough." "Mom?" "Yes?" "Thank you for trusting your instincts, for investigating him, for saving me from making the biggest mistake of my life. Thank you for forgiving me for ruining your first wedding." "You didn't ruin it," Sarah said firmly. "You saved me from it. There's a difference." As the last guests left and we finished cleaning up, I reflected on how much our family had changed over the past 3 years. We'd been tested by betrayal and fraud, but we'd emerged stronger and wiser. Sarah had learned to trust her own judgment while still remaining open to love. I'd learned that sometimes being a protective mother means being willing to be the villain in your child's story, at least temporarily. And we'd both learned that the most important thing in life isn't avoiding all risks. It's learning to recognize which risks are worth taking and which ones are just dangers disguised as opportunities. That night, as I went to bed in my quiet house, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. My daughter was married to a good man who loved her genuinely. Our family had survived a crisis that could have destroyed us, and I'd helped other families avoid similar tragedies through our fraud prevention work. Brad Wilson had tried to con the wrong family. He'd underestimated a mother's instincts and a daughter's resilience. And in the end, his attempt to destroy our lives had only made us stronger. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's building a better life from the wreckage someone else tried to create. And that's exactly what we'd done. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.